In the following talk on corporate governance, Jill Meller, Legal and European Business Director of MTR Corporation Limited, discusses the importance of corporate governance. She starts by giving examples of corporate governance failures and illustrates why getting it right is important. She then chooses 11 hot topics that she deals with every day and discusses some recent trends in corporate governance, providing statistics and examples to make her points.
My name is Jill Meller and I'm MTR's Legal and European Business Director. I should say that this isn't really an academic lecture tonight, so there's no right or wrong in lots of areas of corporate governance. And so what I'm trying to give you is my view on some of the hot topics in corporate governance at the moment. And you will know MTR as the owner and operator of the metro system here in Hong Kong. But also, as you may see from my title, we have operations now around the world. So in Europe, we operate in both the UK and in Sweden. We have operations in 3 cities in the mainland of China and also down in Australia. And so corporate governance is a subject very close to my heart, not just as MTR's legal director and company secretary to the board of our listed company here in Hong Kong, but also as the executive that has oversight for our European business. Because I have to ask myself, what controls do we put in place over our European business to make sure that that business is run in the way that we would wish and in accordance with MTR's corporate values, which are very important to us. Recently in Hong Kong, you may have read, I think it was only last week or at the end of April, the consultation conclusions which were published by the stock exchange in relation to a listing of companies with what are called weighted voting rights. So this is rather than every shareholder having one share entitling them to one vote, certain groups of shareholders having a certain class of shares entitling them to more votes on certain issues. And this you may recall when Alibaba was listing, and Alibaba chose to list in New York rather than in Hong Kong because they weren't allowed to have their weighted voting structure here in Hong Kong. So the stock exchange is now changing the listing rules to allow these kind of companies to list here. But one of the conditions that they have laid down is that these companies must have a corporate governance committee. And a corporate governance committee chaired and comprised only of independent non-executive directors who will have a number of specific duties, but in particular are required to review and monitor whether the listed issuer, the company, is being operated and managed for the benefit of all of its shareholders. So corporate governance continues to be important and continues to be in the news here in Hong Kong and around the world. And why is corporate governance important? Well, I'll start from talking about the people that got it wrong. And the list of corporate governance failures around the world is long and distinguished. So I'll start back in 2001 with the Enron Scandal. This was probably the first big corporate scandal to really hit the headlines around the world. But what they did was developed a scheme that was designed to hide some of the losses that the business was making and to make it appear to be more profitable than the company was. And this was a scheme that the CFO was aware of, that the CEO was aware of, and this was a company that was audited by Arthur Andersen, which at the time was one of the big 5 accounting firms. You now hear that we only have a big 4 accounting firms because this scandal ultimately took not only Enron down, put some of its executives in prison, but also was responsible for the downfall of Arthur Andersen as an accounting firm. So you would think that we would start to learn lessons. But in 2010, and a little bit closer to home, there was the mining company Rio Tinto, who had executives that admitted to taking bribes in a trial in the mainland of China. A few years later, and again in China, GlaxoSmithKline, the pharmaceuticals company, admitted eventually that some of its salesmen were bribing doctors in the mainland of China to buy GSK products as opposed to other pharmaceuticals. And you'll see there, fined $492 million US. So these are not just big reputational issues, but can also have large financial consequences for the companies involved. Moving on a year, in 2015, and there have been lots of scandals involving financial services companies, but 5 here of the world's largest banks pleaded guilty to rigging the currency markets. The bill they were expected to be hit with was more than $5 billion alongside criminal charges. Moving on a year, and this is one of my favourite stories in some ways, and it's a sad story. Wells Fargo is an American bank, and it's an American bank that was very well run historically. So before the 2008 global financial crisis, they were renowned as being a bank that didn't take a lot of risk, that were very responsible as a bank. And so they came through the 2008 financial crisis relatively unscathed, and in fact very well thought of from a corporate governance perspective. But more recently, and again this came from the top down, there was a lot of pressure on their salespeople to cross-sell products. So if you had a bank account with Wells Fargo, they wanted you to buy an insurance policy from them, to buy a credit card from them, to take out some investments with them. And the pressure from the top was such that the employees started opening fake bank accounts, millions of fake bank accounts. And eventually this was found out. And while the fine associated with this was relatively small, $185 million, it had a huge reputational hit on the bank. There were Senate hearings that followed. They had to close 400 of their 6,000 branches. The CEO lost his job, and indeed they lost a lot of major customers. So this is something from which I'm not sure they will ever fully recover. And it's very surprising given the way that the bank was previously run and the values that they prided themselves on. 2017, the head of Samsung jailed for 5 years in a scandal that also brought down the president of South Korea. And here it was alleged that contributions that were made by Samsung were made to entities controlled by a close friend of the president in return for government support for a merger of 2 Samsung-affiliated companies. Coming right up to date, earlier this year in January, a company called Carillion in the UK was put into liquidation. And this company was one of the largest suppliers of facilities management and construction services to various industries in the UK. Issues again here were around the efficacy of external audits. So Carillion was obviously having issues with cash flow. It changed its payment terms from 30 days to 60 days, and nobody was putting up the flags from a disclosure and transparency perspective, and warning that perhaps this might mean that the company had some problems. So not only are the management under the spotlight, but also KPMG, their auditors, for having signed off a clean bill of health when they did their external audits. There were also stories there about payments into pension schemes being inadequate, about payments of wages being withheld, and about executives dumping their own shares once they realised that the company was in trouble. Also this year, Harvey Weinstein, you must all know who this guy is. Would you as an investor want to invest in a company that had the culture of Harvey Weinstein's company? There must have been people within that business that knew what was going on, that knew that non-disclosure agreements were being signed in relation to some of these alleged assaults, and yet were ignoring it and just continuing to run their business. So would you want to invest in a company like that? Would you want to work for a company like that? And if not, and what we'll come on to think about, is what role might the board of directors have of a company setting the corporate culture to make sure that things like happened in the Weinstein company can't exist. And finally, in the bad news stories, to bring it right up to date, the Facebook data privacy scandal. So you will have read, I'm sure, about Facebook using a quiz, or there was a quiz on Facebook, personality quiz, where you typed in, answered the quiz, and it told you what kind of person you were. But the fact that you had accessed this quiz enabled a company called Cambridge Analytica to access a lot of your data. And they were then, the allegation is, using this to influence political processes in different countries. So you will have seen Mark Zuckerberg at a Senate hearing last week trying to explain Facebook's position. You will have seen perhaps earlier this week at their global corporate conference him explaining the steps that they're taking to try and make sure these things don't happen again. So I hope with these bad news stories I've illustrated to you that corporate governance is important and that getting it right is important. And so what I've chosen to talk to you about today is 11, and I'm not quite sure why I picked 11, but 11 hot topics in corporate governance, things that for me as a company secretary, for the Institute of Chartered Secretaries, are very topical at the moment, issues that come across my desk every day. And before I get on to the promised hot topics, there are two overarching trends that I just wanted to share with you this afternoon, which to my mind underlie a lot of these hot topics and a lot of the current changes in corporate governance. So corporate governance used to be about shareholders. So you may have learnt about Milton Friedman, who had a very strong view that the role of a company was to make profits for its shareholders. And it was then up to its shareholders what they did with those profits. They could choose to give money to charity, they could choose to invest in other companies, but the company's real sole stakeholder was its shareholders. And a good company would also pay taxes to the local government, and then it was up to a government to look after social problems. So that's really where corporate governance started. And one definition here from not too long ago was a set of internal control mechanisms that a company puts in place to dissuade potentially self-interested managers who may have a very short-term view in their own paycheck and a short-term increase in the value of the shares from being detrimental to the longer-term welfare of shareholders and stakeholders. So originally, the view around corporate governance was worry about your shareholders. They are the prime stakeholder that you have. Make money for them and don't worry about anything else. I think then this view has shifted to take into account more shareholders. And I've slightly cheekily put up there a quote from myself, which is one that I came up with to try and, in layman's terms, explain corporate governance. And I describe it as the checks and balances that a company puts in place to ensure that it is properly run in the interests of all of its stakeholders. And I wouldn't there pick out shareholders as the prime group of stakeholders. They're clearly very important, but I think there are a lot of other very important stakeholder groups. And that could be for MTR, our customers. It could be our employees. It could be the community in which we operate, because the services that MTR provides are fully integrated with the community here in Hong Kong. It could be the environment. It will no doubt still be our investors, both shareholders and our debt providers. But I would take a much broader view of the stakeholders that you have to take into account when you're thinking about corporate governance. And then I'll shift this on slightly with a quote from a guy from Deloitte. He's the head of their UK Centre for Corporate Governance. And he said in a report they issued earlier this year that if not done already, companies should now be defining and beginning to report on their purpose as a company. What are they about as a company? And how are they engaging with what he calls their ecosystem of employees, of customers and suppliers, and they should be reviewing their impact as a company on society as a whole. So this is making companies a lot more responsible than just taking account of their shareholders. It's saying you also have to look at your broader stakeholder groups and indeed your impact on society as a whole. And when I come on to talk about some of the more specific hot topics, I think you will see this trend sort of threading through the different topics that I will touch on. And the second overarching trend I wanted to talk about is a shift from compliance to doing the right thing. So I think, again, in the past, there was a requirement, an expectation that companies would comply with all laws and regulations to which they were subject, and that somehow that was enough. And I actually think in today's world, it is no longer enough. So you take a company like Starbucks, and I'll use this example because their general counsel here in Hong Kong likes me to tell this tale. But Starbucks had a tax avoidance scheme in Europe. It was a perfectly legal scheme, and it was a way that they organised their business in order to pay effectively the minimum amount of tax. So if you were just thinking about your shareholders, then they were doing the right thing. They complied with all relevant laws, all relevant regulations, and it was a legal scheme. But all of a sudden, people in the UK decided that this scheme wasn't the right thing, because by putting this scheme in place, they weren't paying as much tax in the UK as they would otherwise have done. Now, this may not be a fair view, because actually Starbucks employs a lot of people in the UK. Like in Hong Kong, you find Starbucks on just about every high street. So they were regenerating high streets. They must have been using a lot of local suppliers and engaging with a lot of local businesses. But none of that was taken into account. Somehow society and social media decided that what Starbucks was doing was the wrong thing. And that's a very difficult role as a corporate lawyer, as a company secretary. It's very easy to advise on what the law says and what you should therefore do. But if you have to try and work out what the right thing is, that's a much more difficult question. And I think in today's day and age, particularly with social media, what the right thing is can also change very quickly. So some news will get out on social media, it will immediately spread around the world, and lots of people may have a view about whether something is right or wrong, and all of a sudden as a company, you find yourself trying to respond to that crisis that you've ended up in, because you didn't think beyond what was legal compliance, but really, what are my stakeholders going to think about this? What is society going to think about the way that we operate as a company? And again, I think you'll see this shift in these broader group of stakeholders and the higher expectations that they have run through these themes on corporate governance. It's not an easy subject. I often say, as the company secretary and the legal director at MTR, I have to give my legal advice not in a vacuum, but in the middle of three moving pieces. And one piece that moves is our business. So I mentioned some of MTR's global businesses earlier. And when I joined MTR 14 years ago, we didn't have any international businesses. We were purely a Hong Kong company. So as our company has changed, we need to think about how our corporate governance should change to fit with that expanding company, to fit with the fact that we're now operating in 5 different jurisdictions around the world. The regulatory environment has also changed. 14 years ago, there was no competition law in Hong Kong. The companies ordinance hadn't been refreshed in the way that it was a couple of years ago. And there are now laws and regulations around the world which are having multinational effect. So FATCA is something you may have heard of, is a US tax avoidance law which has a direct impact here in Hong Kong. The UK Bribery Act is something similar. So not only is our business changing, the regulatory environment is changing, and on top of that, stakeholders' expectations are just getting tougher and tougher. So I think when you're thinking about corporate governance, try to think of it not as something that is static, something that is constantly moving to reflect the changing environment. So on to the hot topic. This was a paper recently issued by Deloitte suggesting a number of issues that should be on companies' board of directors' agendas in 2018. And you'll be glad to know that I'm not going to cover all of those tonight, or we could be here until about midnight, I think. But I have selected a few of them. And the first one I want to talk about is activist investors. Now, I'm not sure if these guys are people that you've heard about in previous lectures, but I'll take, to give you an example, one type of activist investor called a short seller. And a short seller is somebody who borrows the shares in a company. So somebody else's shares, they borrow them. They sell them on the basis that they think the share price is going to go down, and that they will then be able to rebuy those shares at a lower price and give them back to the person that they borrowed them from. So it's a restricted practice in some geographies, but it is permissible in lots of places. And so when they're borrowing their shares, they're doing it on the basis they think the share price will go down. And what we're increasingly seeing around the world now is some what are called activist investors who actually take deliberate action to try and make sure the share price goes down during that period that they've borrowed the shares. You can be safe, hopefully, from these activist investors if your corporate governance is good enough and you are being transparent enough in terms of the information that you're releasing to the market. And there are some mixed views around shareholder activism in Asia. I have a couple of quotes here. Unsurprisingly, fund managers don't really think that activist investing will take hold. So they have said aggressive activism hasn't worked very well in Asia. I think any change will be very incremental. There will be no dramatic change. Somebody else, another hedge fund manager, the activist approach is not for Asia. You can't use a pure North American approach. People don't react the same way here. But then in contrast, a quote from Anonymous Analytics, which is a fascinating website if you ever want to take a look, who said the road ahead for Hong Kong to clean up remains long and will be littered with the corpses of more fraudulent companies to come. So despite some of those views, activist investors are active here in Hong Kong. So 78 companies were publicly targeted by activists in Asia in 2016. And they weren't all targeted by short sellers. Some of them were targeted by investors who wanted a change to the board membership. They may have wanted a change in corporate strategy. They may have wanted a change in the remuneration policy of the executives. So there are different ways that investors go about making their demands. And in the first half of 2017, I don't have figures for 2018, a further 38 companies faced public demand from activist investors, and 42% of them would claim to be successful. So they made some demands of a company, and the company reacted to those demands made by the investors. And there's a number, you'll have read some of the famous cases here in Hong Kong. And their claims, their demands relate to the board, as I mentioned, to the balance sheet, to strategy, to remuneration, to M&A activity that the companies may be engaging in. And they may try and rally other investors. They may write letters to the CEO and the chairman. They may turn up at your AGM and cause noise. They may propose a vote of no confidence in the board at an AGM. They may try and instruct the board to behave in a particular way. They may vote against certain resolutions, and they will certainly make a lot of noise in the media, all of which, as a company secretary, you need to be prepared for. So moving on to a second hot topic, board composition. And I'm not going to talk here specifically about diversity, because I'll come on to talk about diversity and gender diversity a little bit later. But there is a broader issue, I think, in corporate governance around board structures and composition. So that could be thinking about the size of the board. It could be thinking about the number and nature of committees that a company has in place. So at MTR, we have the usual three: an audit, a nomination, and a remuneration committee. But on top of that, we have a corporate responsibility committee, a risk committee, and a capital works committee, because of the large capital projects that we're undertaking here in Hong Kong at the moment. So we possibly have more than most. There's also some discussion around the balance of non-executive and independent non-executive directors on a board, with the listing rules obviously specifying a minimum of a third INEDs, but again there being a push for more companies to have more independent non-executive directors. And indeed there are questions asked in Hong Kong, but this hasn't yet been addressed by the stock exchange, as to whether majority shareholders should be able to vote on the appointment of an independent non-executive director, with the argument being that if the majority shareholder votes them in, how can they be independent? How can they be looking after the interests of the minority shareholders? So that's something I think for the future. There's also been some comments, and a recent stock exchange consultation exercise did look at this, which was the nomination process. How are boards finding new directors? And I've got the little cartoon at the bottom there saying, how do we break the old boys network? Lots of search firms around the world will be engaged by companies to find new non-executive and particularly independent non-executive directors. But I think in Hong Kong, that's still a relatively low proportion of companies that find new directors that route. It's more often than not likely to be somebody the chairman knows who they think will add value to the business. And particularly so given such a majority of companies in Hong Kong have such concentrated ownership, in our case in the government, or more often in families. And so the HKEX consultation paper did attempt to address a number of these issues. They are now requiring that companies disclose their nomination policies in their annual report. So companies talk about the process that they go through to find new directors, and show how in finding those directors they will add to the diversity of the board and bring different perspectives, skills and experience to the board. They've also looked at factors affecting an INED's, an independent non-exec director's independence, and tried to tighten the rules around that. And one issue they have looked at is overboarding, which is a director who sits on too many boards to be able to properly do his job. So I'm full of admiration for you guys, because I suspect a lot of you have full-time jobs and you study as well in the evening. But if you have a director that perhaps sits on 15 different boards of companies, can they really do their job properly on each of those 15 boards? And so what the stock exchange is requiring, they're not putting in place a cap saying you can't have more than a certain number of directorships, but they are saying when you are appointed to your 7th or more than 7th directorship, then in the circular that is proposing your nomination, the company has to give reasons for their belief that you will be able to perform your job properly. And so I think Hong Kong is making steps in this direction. Other jurisdictions in the world have much tighter rules. Other jurisdictions would also impose, for example, a time limit. So a director could only serve 3-year terms. Again, not yet here in Hong Kong, but I think it will be coming and very much a hot topic. Moving on, and I promised that I would talk a little bit about the role of a board in determining a company's culture. And I think this is very relevant to a few of the kind of bad news stories that I told you earlier, and particularly the Weinstein company. So this is a company where you had a very powerful guy running this with his brother, I believe, who was engaging allegedly in acts of sexual assault and misconduct. And it's very difficult to think that a lot of people within that company must have known this was going on. Similarly, in Wells Fargo, they were setting these very aggressive sales targets. And people must have known that these millions of new accounts that were being opened can't have all been real. So did people know, and were they turning a blind eye? And what could the board of directors have done of that? You may say, well, the board only meets a few times a year. It's not involved in the day-to-day management of the business. And so how could it influence the culture of the company? Well, there was a recent UK Financial Reporting Council paper, and they came up with a number of key observations in terms of the role that a board of directors can play in setting and then monitoring and reviewing a company's culture. And they said it was critical for the leaders of a company, including the board, to embody the desired culture of a company. The board's role was to determine the purpose of a company and to ensure that the company's values, strategy, and business model were aligned to that purpose. So if you have a value, as I'm sure lots of the companies that we saw earlier failed, had very good corporate values, but you have to make sure your strategy and your business model are aligned to those values. They also felt that the voice of certain functions of a company should be emboldened or strengthened in the boardroom. So functions like human resources, like internal audit, like ethics, like compliance and risk. And so the board of directors has a role in asking to hear from those functions, asking to meet people from the internal audit team and asking them, what have you found in your audits recently? Are you seeing anything that worries you? In having that access to those people that are directly involved in influencing the corporate culture. They also felt that the board had a responsibility to understand behaviour throughout a company, because culture is effectively a combination of values, attitudes and behaviours. So the board should understand the behaviour through the company and challenge the company where they found misalignment between the behaviour and the values, or whether they needed better information in order to really assess whether these sales figures could possibly be true. There was also a finding that the board was responsible for explaining the alignment between values, culture and behaviour and incentives to shareholders. So on what basis are you remunerating your executives? Are you paying them for success in achieving the right culture within the business? And if not, why not? And finally, they felt that the board should engage in effective stewardship, including engagement about culture and better reporting. So you won't generally, in many companies' annual reports, find much about culture. But why not? Because it's an incredibly important attribute of a company. And if you get it wrong, as we've seen, it can have catastrophic consequences. I'll move on to cyber risk. And cyber risk, data privacy, is something you see just about everywhere, every day when you open a newspaper. And it's also an issue I find that terrifies most company secretaries, because I think I don't know much about technology and I don't possibly know what this can have to do with me. But there was a survey done by a company called Protiviti in 2016 looking at executive perspectives on top risks. And 3 of the top 10, one was cyber threats, one was privacy or identity management and information security, and a third was the rapid speed of disruptive innovation and new technologies. And we've seen far more recently the Facebook scandal that I referred to earlier. And so if this is on the board of directors' agenda or at the top of their agenda, then it's something that company secretaries and governance professionals also need to think about. Financial consequences can be high, but also the reputational consequences. From those of you that were around and reading newspapers in 2008, you may recall the Octopus data privacy issue, where Octopus had transferred data of some of its customers to third parties, and this led indeed to an investigation into Octopus's practice, but also to some changes in the data protection guidelines here in Hong Kong, and I think to a tightening of the approach from the Data Privacy Commissioner in terms of the way that he has gone about his business. So as a company secretary or a corporate governance professional, what can you do about cyber risk? Well, you could think about your board composition. Do you have somebody on your board that understands cyber risk, that understands new technologies, and can ask the right questions of management in this area? Can you make sure that technology comes up on the board agenda as a regular topic of discussion, so it's something that's top of mind for board members? Can you make sure, we just talked about the role of the board in setting culture, but can you make sure the board has the right level of oversight on IT and technology issues? Can you look at the internal controls you have in place around technology and perhaps prompt some of your IT colleagues to see if these should be strengthened or at very least reviewed in light of some recent cyber attacks that have occurred somewhere around the world? How do you manage the classified information that you deal with? As company secretaries, you come across huge amounts, not only of personal data about board members, but also of board papers, which may contain classified or secret information about the company. How do you make sure either the hard copies or soft copies of those are not being leaked around, which could cause a huge potential disadvantage to your company? So lots, I think, in this space for the company secretary or the corporate governance professional to think about. So I promised I'd talk about diversity, and obviously as a woman, a subject close to my heart, I will focus a little bit, if you'll allow me, on gender diversity. A statement in the middle of the screen there that in Australia, there are fewer women running top Australian companies than there are men named John or Peter or David. So you have more Johns as CEOs, more Peters as CEOs, and more Davids as CEOs than you have women, which is frankly quite an astounding statistic. And there has, I think, in the world, from investors and from other studies that have been done, there's become an increasing consensus that gender diversity makes sense and it improves the overall economic and social performance of a company. My view on this has always been that having diverse views in a room generally means that you make better decisions. And not all women will think alike and not all men will think alike, but just having a diversity of perspectives must help. When you think about your employee base, you may have 50%, 40%, 60% of women. So why shouldn't you have the same on an executive committee or a board? Think about your customers. For MTR, just about everybody travels on the MTR, and I don't know the gender diversity balance in Hong Kong, but it's probably round about 50-50. So again, why shouldn't that be reflected in our management committees and our board? There's a lot of research that has been caused by influential organisations such as the World Economic Forum on the need for greater respect and opportunities for women. But despite this, I have to say progress in Hong Kong has been somewhat glacially slow. So Community Business have been producing a report on women on board for the last 9 years. And they have said that we've seen only a nominal improvement. So back 9 years ago, we had 8.9% of women on boards. And anybody know what the figure would be this year? Any guesses? We've crept up very slowly to the grand figure of 13.8%. So that's only, 8 to 13, 5% increase in 9 years. So very slow progress. We lag behind other countries. So Singapore, for example, has moved up from 10.9% to 13.1% in a single year. And it's important to say they don't set quotas for women on board. So this is just through voluntary action. There are some positive steps. I think there are organisations like the 30% Club setting voluntary targets for companies here in Hong Kong. But I think there is more that all of us can do. For chairmen to do when they're thinking about searching for new directors. For women to do in terms of encouraging other women coming up through the workforce to be considered for executive or board level positions. So lots more, I think, for us to do in this space. ESG, environmental, social and governance issues. And I think the reason that this is a hot topic really goes back to the earlier comment that I made about companies needing to take into account a much broader group of stakeholders. So not only looking at their shareholders, but looking at their environmental performance, looking at their social performance, looking at their corporate governance. And you can't really see the numbers in the chart on the top right there, it doesn't matter. It's just to illustrate from 2005 to 2016 what an increase there has been in investors looking to invest funds in companies that they believe has good ESG performance. So investors are looking to allocate funds to sustainable investments, and they're requiring companies or expecting companies to manage some longer term risks such as climate change risk. Regulators are tightening requirements in the environmental space. And if you talk to millennials or other younger employees, I don't quite consider myself in that category anymore, then they're interested and they ask you in interviews about your ESG performance. What do you do in terms of community investment? What do you do to control your environmental emissions? So these are all issues that are incredibly relevant and I think are not just or should not just be in the realm of a corporate social responsibility department that is thinking about charitable donations, but they need to be really embedded within a company's business. And you're seeing, again, not so much here yet in Hong Kong, but a shift from companies producing an annual report which looks at their financial performance and a sustainability report which looks at their ESG performance to actually putting those together as an integrated report to explain how they're thinking about all of these different dimensions of their business when they're setting their strategy and they're making decisions. Moving on, and I love this cartoon up here on the left, board evaluation. I've talked a lot tonight about boards of directors and how important they are in getting corporate governance right. So if a board is so essential to remaining in business and being effective in business, why are companies generally so reluctant to assess the performance of their boards? I have to go through an annual appraisal exercise every year with my boss, and he looks at the targets he set me a year before and he assesses, have I met those targets? And we talk about targets for the following year. But boards of directors tend to be much, much more reluctant. And there was a recent study by Spencer Stuart, the recruitment company, who suggested that only 21% of Hang Seng large cap index companies have performed a board evaluation exercise. Now, I suspect some of the reluctance here in Hong Kong is connected to the concentrated ownership structure of a lot of Hong Kong companies, where perhaps a family owner is reluctant to get an independent evaluation of how the business is performing. But this is something that we've done at MTR, and it's something we've tried to think about in a number of different ways. So if you were thinking ever about starting a board evaluation process, I'd suggest you start with an internal process. So for us, this consisted of me working with the chairman to come up with a list of questions that we could send to our board members. We then asked them to fill in a questionnaire, or I gave them a call and they talked me through their responses. And we then, on an anonymous basis, collated their responses, and we made certain changes on the back of what they'd suggested. And that could be around the frequency of board meetings, the length of board meetings, the nature of the discussion at board meetings. It could be around the papers that they receive. It could be around the communications between the board and management. Lots of different areas that you can choose to cover. Now, the challenge, as this cartoon shows, is that if you do a form of self-assessment, if you ask somebody how well they think they're doing, there will generally be a bit of optimism bias in their answer. So I think it's great up there. How have we performed? Brilliantly, extremely well, stunningly, or outstandingly. So the next step is to think about an external evaluation, where you bring in a third party to work with the chairman and the company secretary to perhaps interview the board members. There may still be a questionnaire for them to fill out, but to interview them separately. And we found that in doing that, board members tend to be a little bit more open when they're talking to a third party. And so you perhaps get some more honest feedback that you can then take into account. One very tricky issue, and this is something I've not been brave enough to address yet, is whether you take into account individual performance of directors when you're doing a board evaluation. So do you say, well, how has Mr. X performed this year? Did he contribute properly at board meetings? Did he attend enough board meetings? Did he come on the company visit? Was he there at the AGM? That gets very difficult because it tends to get a little bit personal. And so that's not somewhere that we as MTR have gone yet. Might you include a review of the chairman's performance? Again, it can be a very, very sensitive issue. And how, if you're going to do these things on a regular basis, do you keep them fresh? So in the UK, for example, the Corporate Governance Code requires companies to complete a board evaluation every year and to do an external review every 3 years. So you can't just send the same questionnaire to your board members year in, year out. So perhaps the second year you might think about looking at the performance of a particular committee. Or you might think about looking at how has the board performed in relation to a particular transaction. So when we were acquiring company A, did you feel you got the right information? Did you have the right access to management to discuss your concerns about the acquisition? So try and just be a little bit more specific, or think about doing things differently so that you can keep it fresh for board members. Executive pay. This is an issue that's not really had that much attention in Hong Kong, but I think has had a huge amount of attention from around the world, from politicians, investors, and the media. And the discussion has moved here from being around absolute levels of pay, is somebody paid too much, to being around diversity in pay. So there are requirements in some countries now to publish the difference between the CEO's pay and the average pay of all other employees. There have also been discussions around how much control should shareholders have. Should shareholders have what is called a say on pay? Should they be able to approve how much remuneration the CEO receives every year? In the UK, again, there's been a say on pay in terms of an advisory vote on the remuneration report since 2002. And since 2013, the shareholders have a binding vote on the remuneration policy. So they don't have a binding vote on exactly how many dollars somebody receives, but they would have a binding vote on the way that the remuneration is structured, what is taken into account in determining the remuneration, how are any incentive schemes structured. So very few remuneration packages are being voted down around the world, but there is certainly heightened attention in this area. And I think, therefore, an incentive on companies to be more transparent, to disclose in their annual reports voluntarily how they think about remuneration, how they think about incentives, so that hopefully when you do get to an AGM, you don't get these questions from shareholders. I move on to regulation, and this is an area I think we're all aware has been increasing in the amount of regulation, in the complexity of the legislation. Legislation is increasingly cross-border in nature, and the fines associated with breaches of regulation and legislation are only increasing. So Hong Kong is generally seen as a very friendly place to do business with relatively low levels of regulation. But I mentioned data privacy earlier. The competition ordinance is something that has, the last couple of years, come into force. And there are new European regulations, the GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulations, which have an impact on pretty much any company in Hong Kong which has employees or does certain types of business in the EU. So this is an area that's got more difficult, and I think it's only going to get more difficult going forward. And there was a great quote from the former US Deputy Attorney General: if you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance. So this is an issue that is not going away. Risk and crisis management. You need both, I think. You need to be prepared. You need to take steps to avoid a crisis arising, hopefully by having an appropriate risk management framework in place. But you also need to be prepared such that if your risk management framework fails and you end up in a crisis, how are you going to respond to a crisis? At MTR, we have what we call an enterprise risk management framework. And this we started back in around 2003. We'd always been very good, we felt, at managing operational and safety risks. It's kind of in the nature of our business as a railway company. But had we thought about corporate risks? Had we thought about risks from changes to the prices of some of our resources that we needed? Had we thought about political risks? Had we thought about some of the reputational risks? We weren't sure that we had. And so we put in place a new system that was intended not just to look at operations and safety, but really to look at holistically what were the key risks to the company and the company as an enterprise as a whole, lots of which actually spread across our different divisions. And so we have a top-down and bottom-up process. So we have individual department divisions thinking about the risks that are relevant to their own departments and their own operations. And those then bubble up into a top risk map, which is looked at by the Executive Committee, our board and our Board Risk Committee, who then provide their top-down input to say, okay, you guys are too much in the weeds. Have you thought about these big picture issues? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about what property prices might do in Hong Kong and what that might do to our business? Before we had our new chief executive, did we think about what the election of Carillion might do to MTR's business? So they're just prompting us to make sure we're thinking about the bigger picture as well as the management of the day-to-day risks. And I think around risk, you have to find a language that everybody can understand. And the Corporate Governance Code here in Hong Kong now requires an assessment every year, not only of the effectiveness of your internal control systems, but also of your risk management framework. And what to do when risk management fails. Crisis management. Have a plan. Practice it and then follow it. So we at MTR have a crisis management plan. We run crisis exercises every 6 months or so. A scenario is selected and we all get a phone call to go into our executive conference room and we play out the crisis. And you learn some real lessons through those exercises. So things like having very clear lines of communication, working out who your key stakeholders are. Because if you're the executive sat in headquarters in an executive conference room, and we've had an issue with a train out somewhere up on West Rail, the guys who are actually managing the incident on the ground will be our operations colleagues up in the new territories. So actually a lot of what our role is back at headquarters is liaising with stakeholders, making sure the right information and accurate information is provided to the right people at the right times. And it's very difficult because when an incident first happens, chances are you don't know what's happened. You don't know the root cause. You don't necessarily know what you can do, how long it will take to fix it. You don't necessarily know what you can do to stop it happening again. And so it's that challenge of responding quickly, but making sure you've got the right information. And my final one, I think this is number 11, shareholder engagement. There's a lovely quote at the top there, a continent marching slowly but steadily towards an era of shareholder engagement. And I think that's true. I think a lot of times in the past, people thought about engaging with shareholders through their annual reports, perhaps once a year through their AGMs. But from talking to some people, a lot of AGMs in Hong Kong tend to be very short affairs without really much chance for shareholders to engage with the management and the board of the company. And so I think this is changing. There's a lot more work now being done in investor relations. Throughout the course of the year, in good times particularly, as well as in bad, talking to your investors, talking to them about your financial performance, talking to them about your ESG performance, holding your AGM in such a way that it is really an opportunity for them to meet with your management and your directors. If you're a small shareholder of a big company, it's the only chance you get to speak directly to the chairman and to ask him a question about strategy or where a business is going. So I would say take them seriously. Another advent is for shareholders asking to have meetings directly with independent non-executive directors. It hasn't come up yet for us, but I think if we did get that request, we would agree to it, albeit we would want to know what they wanted to talk to the INEDs about, because you couldn't expect an INED to have day-to-day in-depth knowledge of the operations of a business. But they would know, hopefully, about the values, about the strategy, about the culture. And so if shareholders wanted to talk to them about that, that's something that we would be open to. So I hope, in conclusion, that I've shown you tonight that corporate governance does indeed matter. I hope I've shown you that corporate governance needs to encompass both hard internal controls, things like risk management systems, things like cyber security systems, but it also needs to incorporate the soft internal controls. You need to get the culture right. You need to get the communications right. You need to get the people right. I hope I've shown you that corporate governance isn't a static thing, that it needs to be agile, and it needs to respond to the changing needs of a business, to the changing regulatory environment, and importantly, to changing stakeholder and societal expectations. But it's still a very difficult thing to see, corporate governance. And so I say good corporate governance may almost be invisible. But on the other hand, as I started off, bad corporate governance is only too visible to everybody. So with that, thank you very much.